he thought he knew his home. A mansion built on success, a place of comfort and trust. But one evening, when he returned earlier than expected, he stepped into a nightmare he never imagined. Behind closed doors, in the very space meant to protect, something dark was unfolding. In that moment, the silence of wealth was shattered, not by noise, but by cruelty. A child, innocent and defenseless, became the target of violence she did not deserve. And the one inflicting the pain? Someone who should have known better. It wasn't just about one cruel act. What he witnessed pulled back the curtain on a truth too many choose to ignore, a truth about power, prejudice, and the way society treats those it deems less. This story isn't comfortable. It isn't simple. But it's one that forces us to ask, what do you do when injustice lives inside your own home? By all appearances, Richard Coleman had everything. A sprawling mansion tucked behind tall iron gates, a fortune built on years of hard work and smart decisions, and a reputation as a man who treated people with respect. To the outside world, he was the image of success, the kind of man others looked at with admiration and quiet envy. Inside his home, life seemed stable. His wife, Caroline, managed the household with precision. She was known in social circles for her elegance and composure, always dressed immaculately, always smiling in photographs. To neighbors and friends, the couple seemed like a perfect match, wealth, beauty, and influence wrapped into one polished package. But like most homes that look flawless from the outside, cracks existed. Richard's work demanded long hours, late meetings, and endless travel. It left Caroline in charge of the house most of the time. And in that silence of absence, her true self often slipped through the mask she wore in public. Among those who witnessed it was the maid, Marisol, a quiet woman who had come from a life of hardship. She lived not for herself, but for her daughter, Alina. For Marisol, working in the Coleman household was more than a job, it was survival. Every paycheck meant food on the table, school supplies for Alina, and the fragile hope of a better future. Alina was just 12 years old. Bright-eyed, full of energy, with a smile that could light up even the darkest of days. Whenever she visited her mother at work, she carried an innocence that made her presence feel like sunshine in a place that could sometimes grow cold. Richard liked Alina. He saw in her the same hunger for life he had once carried as a child from a modest background. Though he rarely had time to speak at length, he would often smile at her, ask how school was going, or slip her a small book he thought she might enjoy. To him, she was just a child who deserved kindness. To Marisol, she was everything. Caroline, however, didn't share that warmth. Where Richard saw innocence, Caroline saw intrusion. She disliked the way Alina sometimes wandered into rooms, the way her laughter echoed down the halls, or the way her presence reminded her of the invisible boundaries between those who owned and those who served. Caroline had grown up in privilege, accustomed to order and control, and she saw Marisol and her daughter not as people, but as reminders of a hierarchy she believed should never be questioned. Still, Richard never suspected the depth of this coldness. His life was a blur of meetings and travel, and he trusted that his home remained a place of decency in his absence. He believed that Caroline carried herself with the same grace behind closed doors as she did in public. It was a fragile illusion, one that would soon be shattered. Because on a quiet evening, when Richard decided to leave the office earlier than usual, he stepped into a world he had never seen before. The perfect image of his home was about to collapse. And as his footsteps echoed across the marble floors, he was about to discover that the cruelty of the world didn't always wait outside your gates. Sometimes, it lived right inside them. The evening Richard came home early began like any other. The city was alive with its usual hum, cars flashing past on crowded streets, skyscrapers glowing as the sun dipped below the horizon. Richard's driver offered to take him straight home, but tonight he wanted silence, space to think. He asked to be dropped a few blocks away and chose to walk. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint smell of rain, and his mind was preoccupied with contracts, deals, and numbers. But as he turned the corner leading to his estate, he felt something strange, an uneasiness he couldn't explain. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was fate. Either way, the steps he took that evening carried him toward a truth he had been blind to for too long. The mansion stood tall, its windows glowing warmly, a beacon of comfort in the dim light. Richard had built this house to be untouchable, a fortress against the chaos of the outside world. But fortresses don't just keep things out. They also keep secrets in. He slipped through the front gate quietly, not wanting to announce his early arrival. The house was still, but not silent. From deep inside, faint sounds drifted, shuffling, a muffled cry, then a sharp, commanding voice. Richard froze. That voice was familiar. Caroline. The sound drew him forward, each step heavy, the marble floors echoing beneath his shoes. He followed the noise down the hallway, past portraits and polished furniture, until he reached the living room. What he saw stopped him cold. Alina, sweet, innocent Alina, was cowering in the corner, her small frame shaking. Her hands shielded her face, but her sobs betrayed her terror. And standing over her was Caroline, her hand raised, her eyes blazing with a cruelty Richard had never seen before. For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. Caroline, his wife, the woman praised for her charm and grace, was striking a child. Not just any child, a child who had never done her harm, who had only ever brought laughter into their home. Why are you here? Caroline's voice sliced the air, harsh and unforgiving. You don't belong in this room. You don't belong here at all. Alina whimpered, trying to speak, but the words dissolved into sobs. Richard's heart pounded. Every instinct told him to intervene, to stop what was happening, but his body felt locked in place. And then Caroline's words turned colder. You think this is your home? You think you can just wander in as if you belong? People like you never belong. Not here. Not anywhere. The venom in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just discipline, or impatience, or frustration. This was hate. Ugly, deliberate hate, sharpened by the poison of prejudice. Richard stepped forward at last, his voice booming through the room. Caroline. She spun around, startled, her face draining of color when she saw him. For the briefest second, panic flickered in her eyes, quickly replaced by a brittle smile. Richard. I didn't know you were home. But it was too late. He had seen everything. The silence that followed felt endless. Caroline tried to smooth her dress, to compose herself, as if she could erase what had just happened. But the truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable. Alina's sobs broke the silence. She tried to stand, her small body trembling, and Richard rushed to her side. The fear in her eyes cut through him like a blade. He had built his fortune to create safety, to build walls against danger. Yet here, inside his own home, danger had taken the shape of the person closest to him. Richard's mind spun. How long had this been happening? How many times had Caroline lashed out when he wasn't there? What cruelty had Alina endured in the shadows of his absence? And worst of all, how had he not seen it? But before he could ask, Caroline's mask cracked again. Don't look at me like that, she snapped. She doesn't belong here. She is not one of us. Her mother should know her place, and so should she. Her words echoed in the room, each one a strike against the fragile illusion Richard had clung to. This wasn't just about Caroline's temper. This was about something deeper, a belief she had carried all along. A belief that people like Marisol and Alina were beneath her. That wealth and skin color drew lines no one should cross. Richard felt rage building inside him, but alongside it was guilt. He had ignored the subtle signs, the whispers of disdain in Caroline's tone, the way she looked at Marisol with condescension. He had dismissed them as quirks, as small flaws. But those small flaws had festered into something monstrous. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Even after sending Alina home with her shaken mother, even after Caroline retreated into silence, the images replayed in his mind. The raised hand. The trembling child. The words that dripped with hatred. And with each replay, his sense of reality cracked further. He had built his empire on fairness and vision. He had prided himself on being a man who valued dignity, no matter who stood before him. But in his own house, under his own roof, injustice had been allowed to thrive. The days that followed only deepened the tension. Caroline acted as if nothing had happened, carrying on with her routines, planning social events, smiling for photographs. But behind closed doors, her disdain sharpened. She made no attempt to hide her contempt for Marisol and Alina. Every glance, every word, was laced with venom. Richard began watching more closely. And the more he watched, the more he realized this wasn't an isolated incident. Alina flinched whenever Caroline entered the room. Marisol avoided eye contact, her shoulders always tense. It was the look of people who lived in fear. And fear, Richard knew, doesn't grow overnight. It grows over time, fed by repeated cruelty. Each discovery tightened the knot in his chest. He couldn't escape the truth anymore. His wife wasn't just unkind. She was dangerous. Yet a question lingered: what would he do about it? If he confronted her, she would deny it. If he exposed her, the scandal could destroy everything he had built. But if he did nothing, the cycle would continue. And with every passing day, the stakes grew higher. Because one night, Richard overheard something that pushed him past the point of no return. Caroline's voice, sharp and unyielding, telling Marisol, "Remember your place. I can ruin you. One word from me, and you'll have nothing." The threat was unmistakable. It wasn't just cruelty now, it was power wielded like a weapon. And Richard knew, in that moment, that silence was no longer an option. What he didn't know was that his decision to act would ignite consequences far greater than he imagined. Because the battle he was about to face wasn't just inside his home, it was against a system, a mindset, a prejudice far older and far stronger than one woman's cruelty. And once it began, there would be no turning back. Thunder rolled in the distance, heavy clouds cloaking the sky, as if the world itself sensed the darkness that was about to unfold inside the Coleman mansion. Richard had been restless all evening, pacing, replaying Caroline's words over and over in his mind. He had promised himself he would confront her, expose her cruelty, protect Alina and Marisol no matter the cost. But before he could act, the storm revealed what was hidden. From upstairs, a scream tore through the silence. Not a sharp cry of surprise, but a scream born of terror. Richard raced toward the sound, his chest tight, his footsteps echoing against the marble. He burst into the guest quarters and froze. Caroline stood over Alina again, this time gripping her arms so tightly that the girl's skin had turned pale beneath her fingers. Marisol pleaded on her knees, begging Caroline to stop. The scene was chaos, Alina trembling, Marisol sobbing, and Caroline shouting words that cut deeper than any slap. "You people don't belong here. You never will. This house, this life, it is not for you." The storm outside cracked with lightning, illuminating the raw hatred etched across Caroline's face. Richard felt his world collapse in that instant. This was no longer hidden cruelty. This was violence in its purest form. He stepped forward, his voice shaking with fury. "Let her go." Caroline turned, her grip tightening on Alina. For a moment, their eyes locked, husband and wife, two people who had built a life together now standing on opposite sides of a moral chasm. "You don't understand, Richard," she hissed. "They will never be equal to us. This is how the world works." Her words landed like a knife. The woman he had trusted, the partner he had believed in, was now unmasked, revealing a truth far uglier than he could have imagined. Richard lunged forward, pulling Alina free, shielding her small body against his chest. He could feel her heart racing, the tremors of her sobs. Marisol clung to her daughter's hand, eyes wide with both terror and relief. But Caroline didn't back down. Her rage only grew. "You'll destroy everything," she screamed. "Your reputation, your fortune. You'll lose it all for them." And in that moment, Richard realized the choice before him. It was more than just his marriage at stake. It was his soul. His legacy. The line between right and wrong had never been clearer, and the cost of choosing right had never been higher. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the windows as if the world demanded an answer. Richard's voice cut through it all, steady and unyielding. Then let it be destroyed. The words silenced the room. Caroline's face twisted with disbelief, but Richard no longer wavered. He had made his choice. He would stand with Marisol and Alina, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built. Yet as he turned to comfort the terrified child, he knew this was not the end. Exposing Caroline meant exposing the prejudice woven into their world. And once the truth left these walls, the battle would not just be against his wife, it would be against society itself. The question burned in his mind, would they listen? Or would they turn away, like they always had? The lightning flashed once more, throwing shadows across the room. Richard tightened his hold on Alina, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of real fear, not for himself, but for the innocent lives he had vowed to protect. And as the storm raged on, he knew, the hardest part of the fight was only beginning. The storm eventually passed, but the weight of that night never lifted. Richard had chosen to act, not with silence, not with compromise, but with truth. In the days that followed, the carefully constructed walls of his life began to collapse. Friends whispered, colleagues questioned, the media circled like hawks. To expose what Caroline had done meant to unravel not just his marriage, but the image of perfection that had shielded his family for years. Yet Richard didn't flinch. He stood before the world and told the truth. He spoke of what he had witnessed, of the cruelty hidden behind wealth and appearances, of the hatred that had nearly broken an innocent child. Some praised his courage. Others condemned him, calling him reckless, accusing him of betraying his own class. But Richard knew this was no betrayal, it was justice long overdue. For Marisol and Alina, life would never be the same. Though scarred by what they endured, they carried with them the power of being seen, of having their pain acknowledged instead of erased. Richard made sure they were safe, that Alina had the chance to study, to dream, to live without the constant fear of someone reminding her she didn't belong. Caroline's downfall was swift. Her reputation shattered, her circle of influence crumbled, leaving her isolated. But the greater story wasn't just about her, it was about what she represented. She wasn't the first, nor would she be the last, to use power as a weapon against those deemed less. And that was the truth Richard couldn't escape. This wasn't just about one woman's cruelty or one family's fracture. It was about the larger system that allowed such hatred to flourish in silence. A system where wealth could mask prejudice, where skin color could dictate worth, and where countless voices went unheard because no one with power bothered to listen. As Richard reflected on it all, he realized something painful but undeniable. His wealth had insulated him, blinded him to the quiet suffering of those who worked in the shadows of his world. He had prided himself on fairness, yet fairness meant nothing if it ignored the cruelty happening right at his doorstep. And so he vowed that his silence would never return. The story of that night spread far beyond his home. It sparked conversations in boardrooms and classrooms, in dinner tables and news segments. Some dismissed it as scandal. Others saw it as a mirror, forcing them to confront truths they preferred to ignore. For every person who turned away, there were others who leaned in, willing to ask, if this could happen in his house, how many others are living through it right now, unseen and unheard? The answer was not comforting. For Marisol and Alina, and for millions like them, injustice was not a single night. It was daily, constant, grinding. It lived in whispered insults, in closed doors, in unequal opportunities, in the violence that too often went unpunished. What Richard had seen was only the surface of a much deeper wound. And that is where the impact truly lay, not just in one man's choice to confront the cruelty within his home, but in the challenge his story posed to the rest of us. Because if injustice can hide behind the walls of the powerful, how much more often does it hide in the corners of everyday life? In schools, in workplaces, in neighborhoods where silence protects the guilty and fear silences the vulnerable? The lesson of that night was clear: racism and prejudice do not survive in isolation. They survive in silence. They survive when good people look away, when those with power convince themselves it isn't their fight, when we trade discomfort for convenience. Richard's life changed forever. He lost friends, reputation, and comfort, but he gained something greater. He gained clarity. He understood that the real measure of a life is not in wealth or success, but in the courage to stand when it matters most. And that clarity came with a cost he was willing to pay. So, as the storm clouds of that night faded into memory, the question lingered, not just for Richard, not just for Marisol or Alina, but for all of us. When injustice walks into your home, your street, your life, will you look away? Or will you stand? Because one story can be ignored. 100 can be dismissed. But millions of voices rising together? That cannot be silenced. This is not just Richard's story. It is not just Alina's or Marisol's. It is a story that has echoed for generations, reshaped by new names, new faces, but always the same wound. And until we choose to face it, until we choose to act, the storm will never truly pass. So the final question is not what Richard did, but what you will do.